Invasion.
God.
The speed of conquest
Look at
stunned
that.
the world and exposed
Germans.
both the effectiveness
The whole
of
column is
modern
here.
mechanized warfare and the unpreparedness of the Allies. Italy entered the war, hoping to share in Axis victories, but its campaigns in North Africa faltered against
Cable 6,
well-organized
this is Baker 2.
British
We are
forces.
advancing grid reference
Meanwhile, in
452.
Asia,
Over.
Japan continued to expand into China, and by 1941, looked towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Germany's early successes created the illusion of unstoppable momentum, but each victory carried hidden risks: overextended supply lines, overconfidence, and the inevitable resistance of occupied populations. The strategic turning point became clearer with Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military campaign in history, aimed to crush the Soviet state in a single blow. Yet, logistical overreach, harsh winter, and fierce Soviet resistance transformed initial success into protracted struggle. Germany was now fighting on multiple fronts, its resources stretched, and its enemies growing stronger by the day. By late 1941, Hitler's early triumphs had shifted from brilliance to vulnerability. The combination of overextension, the resilience of opponents, and miscalculations in leadership ensured that the war, once a series of lightning victories, would evolve into a prolonged and costly global conflict. The initial sparks that ignited in Poland now fueled a conflagration spanning Europe, Africa, and Asia. By 1945, the world bore the scars of a war that had begun with failed diplomacy and unchecked ambition. Europe lay in ruins. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, and London were reduced to rubble by relentless bombing campaigns. Industrial centers, transportation networks, and homes were destroyed, leaving millions of civilians homeless and starving. The human cost was staggering. Tens of millions of military and civilian lives were lost, and entire societies were transformed by trauma and displacement. Germany's defeat was total. Hitler was dead, having committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, leaving a shattered command structure behind. The surrender of German forces marked the end of the Third Reich, but also revealed the extent of the devastation left in its wake. Soldiers and civilians alike faced the consequences of aggressive ideology and overextended campaigns. Prisoners of war were held, nations struggled to restore governance, and the sheer scale of destruction challenged recovery efforts for decades. The Allies now confronted the task of reconstruction and justice. Denazification programs sought to dismantle the mechanisms of totalitarian control, holding leaders and collaborators accountable through tribunals and trials. Evidence of atrocities, including concentration camps, forced labor, and mass executions, shocked the world, cementing the moral imperative behind Allied victory. The war's aftermath demanded both rebuilding of infrastructure and of ethical frameworks, highlighting the catastrophic cost of unchecked ambition. Economically, Europe faced unprecedented challenges. Factories had been destroyed, agriculture disrupted, and trade networks severed. Nations relied on international aid, most notably the Marshall Plan in Western Europe, to rebuild economies and stabilize societies. In the East, Soviet control reshaped borders and governance, sowing seeds for decades of political tension. The early failures of diplomacy, combined with ideological extremism and strategic miscalculations, had unleashed destruction on a global scale. But they also illuminated lessons about leadership, planning, and human resilience, setting the stage for a new world order. Beyond Europe, the consequences of World War II reshaped the global order. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, their influence extending across continents. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, establishing a buffer zone that would define the Cold War. Western Europe, meanwhile, slowly rebuilt with Allied support, laying the foundations for economic recovery, cooperation, and eventually the European Union. Militarily, the war demonstrated the limits of ideology-driven decision-making. Blitzkrieg, while initially effective, could not sustain campaigns against resilient, coordinated opposition. Logistics, intelligence, and adaptability proved as decisive as weaponry. The Allies' emphasis on mass production, resource management, and multi-front coordination contrasted sharply with Axis overextension and miscalculation. These lessons informed military strategy for decades. For civilians, the war left lasting scars. Millions of refugees traversed destroyed landscapes, searching for family, shelter, and food. Survivors of occupation and genocide grappled with trauma and loss, while nations confronted the ethical and social costs of totalitarian regimes. Denazification, war crimes tribunals, and public reckoning highlighted the moral consequences of unchecked aggression. Globally, the aftermath reinforced the necessity of collective security. The United Nations was established to prevent another world war, and nations recognized the importance of diplomacy, international law, and cooperation. Economic institutions, such as the World Bank and IMF, emerged to stabilize economies and promote development. By 1945, the world had learned a harsh lesson. Unresolved grievances, economic hardship, ideological extremism, and diplomatic failure could converge to trigger unprecedented destruction. Hitler's ambitions, unchecked for too long, had reshaped continents, lives, and the global balance of power, leaving a legacy that would influence international relations for generations. The outbreak of World War II was not sudden. It was the inevitable consequence of unresolved tensions, economic crises, and ideological extremism. The failures of diplomacy, the rise of authoritarian regimes, and the fragility of international institutions combined to create conditions in which aggression could thrive unchecked. What began as regional ambitions escalated into a global conflict because the mechanisms to contain them had failed. The human cost was staggering. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians perished. Entire cities were destroyed, societies displaced, and cultures scarred. Yet within this devastation, human resilience endured. Populations survived under occupation. Armies adapted to unprecedented. And soon the world was about to be consumed in conflict on a scale unprecedented in human history. The outbreak of World War II was rooted in the collapse of international diplomacy. The League of Nations, designed to prevent conflict, lacked the authority to enforce its resolutions. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 or Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, the League's sanctions were largely symbolic. Appeasement became the default policy for Britain and France. The Munich Agreement of 1938 meant to secure peace for our time, instead demonstrated that aggression could be rewarded. Leaders underestimated Hitler's ambitions, failing to recognize that concessions would embolden rather than deter. Political hesitation and fragmented alliances created a vacuum in which expansionist powers could act with impunity. Economic angle, depression and resource competition. The global economic depression of the 1930s fueled instability and extremism. Germany's economy, crippled by reparations and unemployment, created fertile ground for Hitler's promises of revival and territorial expansion. Italy and Japan faced similar pressures. Resource shortages and economic stagnation drove military solutions. Nations competed for scarce resources, whether oil in the Middle East, coal in Europe, or iron in Africa. Economic desperation translated into aggressive foreign policies, making war a seemingly viable means to secure survival and national prestige. Ideological angle, nationalism and totalitarianism. Extreme ideologies provided both motivation and justification for expansion. Fascism in Italy glorified military conquest, authoritarian obedience, and national pride. Nazi Germany combined nationalism with racial ideology, framing conquest as both a strategic necessity and a moral imperative. In Japan, militarism and emperor-centered nationalism justified imperial expansion across East Asia. These ideologies left little room for compromise or negotiation, prioritizing conquest and domination over diplomacy. Germany, Italy, and Japan's early expansions were initially successful, but each misstep revealed the limits of their strategies. Germany's invasions of Austria and Czechoslovakia, while unopposed, stretched diplomatic credibility and created complex territorial disputes. Italy's North African campaigns overextended supply lines, while Japan's incursions into China provoked prolonged resistance. These tactical decisions, while appearing advantageous in the short term, set the stage for broader conflict as opposing powers were eventually drawn in. Human angle: fear, propaganda, and public opinion. Societal attitudes played a crucial role. Propaganda across Germany, Italy, and Japan rallied populations around nationalistic and militaristic causes. Fear of communism, humiliation, and economic collapse drove public support for aggressive policies. Simultaneously, populations in Europe and Asia reacted with anxiety and indecision, allowing leaders to pursue risky policies with minimal resistance. The collective psychology of nations, ambition, fear, and complacency, enabled the escalation toward global war. International angle: weakness and isolationism. The reluctance of major powers to act decisively allowed aggression to flourish. Britain and France, traumatized by WWII, hesitated to confront early violations of treaties. The United States maintained isolationism, reluctant to commit military power overseas. The Soviet Union, wary of provoking Germany or Japan, pursued short-term security through non-aggression pacts rather than collective defense. This combination of weakness, miscalculation, and self-interest created a permissive environment in which Axis powers could expand unchecked. These perspectives, strategic miscalculations, human psychology, and international weakness, demonstrate that the outbreak of World War II was a complex interplay of decisions, pressures, and circumstances. September 1st, 1939. German tanks rolled across the Polish border, their engines rumbling through towns that had known peace for decades. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields and railways, while infantry swept forward in coordinated blitzkrieg maneuvers. Poland, despite desperate resistance, was overwhelmed within weeks. The rapid success demonstrated Germany's military efficiency, but also exposed the inevitability of global escalation. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world had crossed a threshold. Appeasement had failed. The conflict, once a distant worry, became immediate and all-encompassing. European alliances solidified, and nations mobilized for the first time since the Great War. The global balance shifted as Axis powers prepared to consolidate gains while allies sought to coordinate defenses. In Asia, Japan intensified its campaigns in China, seizing territories and expanding control over resource-rich regions. The Second Sino-Japanese War merged with broader geopolitical tensions, linking European and Asian theaters. Germany's rapid victories emboldened Italy, which prepared campaigns in North Africa, further extending the reach of Axis ambitions. By early 1940, the stage was set for a series of decisive campaigns. Norway, Denmark, France, and the Low Countries faced imminent invasion. Each Axis move, while tactically brilliant, increased the scale of conflict and drew neutral nations into a growing war. The initial sparks in Poland had ignited a chain reaction that would engulf Europe and eventually the world. The decisions made in these early months, rapid invasions, delayed responses, and misjudged alliances, would define the course of the coming global war. Momentum had shifted irreversibly, signaling that the conflict would not remain localized but expand into a true world war. By spring 1940, the war expanded dramatically. Germany launched a stunning campaign through Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally France. Utilizing blitzkrieg tactics, armored divisions, and Luftwaffe coordination shattered defensive lines with unprecedented speed. Paris fell in June 1940, leaving Britain isolated and facing the threat of September 1938. Berlin streets thrummed with tension. Propaganda banners fluttered from every building, promising strength and unity. Crowds murmured anxiously as radios crackled with news of the Sudetenland crisis. Across Europe, diplomats debated borders, while ordinary citizens sensed the shadow of war creeping closer. In London, newspapers screamed of appeasement, of a continent on the edge. In Tokyo, military leaders plotted expansion into China, unconcerned with distant treaties. In Paris, the fear of another devastating conflict haunted every council meeting. Across oceans, nations watched, waiting, uncertain whether the lessons of the Great War had been learned or forgotten entirely. Amid this fragile calm, decisions were being made that would shape the world for decades. Borders would be redrawn, alliances tested, and millions of lives caught in the gears of ideology, ambition, and fear. The world teetered on the brink. A single spark, whether diplomacy failed or aggression prevailed, would ignite a global inferno. History was about to unfold, not as a surprise, but as the inevitable outcome of unresolved tensions, human ambition, and the fragile balance of power. The seeds of World War II were sown in the aftermath of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh reparations on Germany, stripped it of territory, and limited its military. What was intended as a framework for lasting peace instead fostered resentment. Germans felt humiliated, their economy crippled, their national pride wounded. Across Europe, borders drawn with little regard for ethnic or historical realities created tension and instability. The 1920s and 1930s brought global economic turmoil. The Great Depression of 1929 sent shockwaves worldwide. Unemployment soared, trade collapsed, and nations struggled to maintain political stability. Economic hardship created fertile ground for extremist movements. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party capitalized on public anger, promising to restore pride, rebuild the military, and reclaim lost territories. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists exploited nationalist sentiment, while Japan's military pursued expansion in East Asia, seeking resources and regional dominance. International diplomacy proved weak and indecisive. The League of Nations, created to prevent another war, lacked enforcement power. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, sanctions were symbolic, the aggression went unchecked. Italy's conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 further exposed the League's impotence. Europe's major powers preferred appeasement over confrontation, hoping to avoid conflict by conceding to aggressors. Germany's early moves in defiance of Versailles foreshadowed the coming storm. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the Anschluss with Austria in 1938, and the annexation of the Sudetenland later that year revealed both Hitler's ambition and the hesitancy of the Allies. Each concession emboldened him, demonstrating that aggression could yield rewards without immediate consequences. Meanwhile, alliances were fragile. Britain and France, still recovering from the First World War, hesitated to confront Germany directly. The United States remained isolationist, focusing on domestic recovery. This combination of economic strain, diplomatic failure, and rising nationalism created a precarious balance. Hitler's Germany, Japan's militarism, and Italy's fascist ambitions were all accelerating toward confrontation. By the late 1930s, Europe and Asia were no longer merely tense. They were primed for conflict. The unresolved issues from the previous war, combined with economic despair and the rise of totalitarian ideologies, made a second global conflict not just possible, but increasingly inevitable. By 1939, the ambitions of Axis powers had crystallized into concrete plans for expansion. Germany, under Hitler, sought not only to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, but to establish a dominant European empire. Italy, led by Mussolini, aimed to revive the glory of the Roman Empire through conquests in Africa and the Mediterranean. In the East, Japan pursued control over China and access to vital resources, escalating conflicts that had begun years earlier. Diplomatic efforts faltered. The Munich Agreement of 1938 intended to preserve peace by allowing Germany to annex the Sudetenland, demonstrated the failure of appeasement. Hitler interpreted concessions as weakness, emboldening his regime. Meanwhile, Britain and France scrambled to rearm, but their efforts lagged behind Germany's aggressive buildup. Military alliances were forming, but coordination was inconsistent. Economic pressures intensified global tensions. Germany's industrial recovery relied heavily on access to raw materials and living space, while Japan faced severe resource shortages that drove its expansion into Manchuria and beyond. The United States, tied to domestic recovery, remained reluctant to intervene, while the Soviet Union, wary of both Germany and Japan, pursued its own strategic positioning through non-aggression pacts and territorial adjustments. By August 1939, the world's fragile equilibrium was breaking. Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This agreement shocked the international community and cleared the way for Hitler's immediate ambitions in Poland. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland, triggering the formal declarations of war by Britain and France 2 days later. What had begun as simmering tensions, unresolved grievances, and unchecked ambitions had now erupted into open conflict. The failures of diplomacy, the rise of extremist ideologies, and the miscalculations of major powers converged to create the conditions for a global war. Europe, challenges, and nations united to confront a common threat. These acts of endurance and solidarity underscore the capacity for humanity to respond to crisis, even amidst unimaginable loss. Strategically and politically, the war offered enduring lessons. Military success depends not only on innovation and firepower, but also on logistics, leadership, and adaptability. Ideology, when unchecked, can blind leaders to reality, resulting in catastrophic miscalculations. The coordinated effort of Allied powers demonstrated the effectiveness of strategic planning, international collaboration, and sustained commitment. Finally, the aftermath of the war reshaped the world. Borders were redrawn, new institutions were created, and the principles of collective security and international cooperation became central to global governance. The lessons of 1939 to 1945 endure. Unchecked ambition and ideological extremism can spark destruction on a global scale, but resilience, cooperation, and foresight remain humanity's most powerful tools to prevent it. World War II reminds us that history is shaped not just by battles, but by the choices, failures, and foresight of nations and individuals, and that the consequences of those choices can echo across generations.